Just getting to work. It is 12:10 a.m. Central Standard Time. My boy just getting to work. Probably see him up there, locking the door up, getting ready to get going. You might as well call both of us Mr. 6 days. Short day today. So just like that, I'm off work, man. You guys seen me. It was still dark out. Now, as you can see, sunrise, man. I'm done for the day. It is a little after 7 o'clock in the morning. A light day. Knocked it out. It made a little extra coin. Listen, I wanted to drop this video before I pull off from the yard. People don't quit jobs. They quit bosses. Let me repeat that. People don't quit jobs. They quit bosses. That's a saying that I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard before. And I wanted to kind of share my thoughts on that. Listen, I think two things can be true. I definitely think people quit bosses and not jobs. But I also think that there are a variety of different reasons why people quit jobs, right? That's not necessarily the case for every situation. For example, the job that I had prior to my current job, my very first trucking job, I had phenomenal managers. I had great leadership. That wasn't the reason why I left that job. I left that job because I felt like I was overworked and underpaid. It was a terrible situation in terms of the compensation and just the overall amount of work you had to do for a little pay is what really pushed me out the door, right? It was temporary. As a new Class A CDL driver, you guys know if you're in the trucking industry, it really comes down to experience as it relates to the opportunities that you can have in the trucking industry. Everybody knows the more experience you have, the better job opportunities that are going to be available to you. And so, just starting out as a new driver, it's all about just getting the reps in, getting your experience up so you can venture out if you want to find, better paying jobs and just better overall opportunities. And so that's what it was for me, man. That was my situation. Again, that wasn't a situation where my management was so bad I left. It just wasn't for me in terms of um, the things I just mentioned. Low compensation and just the overall work, it just wasn't worth it. But let's go back to people quitting jobs due to bosses, right? That is true. There are some bad managers out there, bad supervisors. There's some terrible leadership out there with various companies. If I'm being fully transparent, it's been a long time since I've worked for a terrible boss or bad leadership. I've been fortunate enough, my last few jobs, especially this one that I'm currently at, the leadership has been great. My management team is very supportive, at least in my opinion. And I don't really have any complaints in terms of the leadership. But I can definitely understand anybody who leaves a job due to poor management. Um, you know, when you're being micromanaged or, you're working hard and your efforts, aren't being acknowledged through your leadership. I think that's important as a manager, by the way. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But, being in a toxic environment, all those things can cause people to quit their jobs. Even if the job itself is a good job and the pay is good, sometimes if the management is bad enough, people don't care about how much money they're making. They just don't want to deal with the stress of working under that type of leadership. So a lot of people are willing to leave a job due to the managers. If you're dealing with somebody, a supervisor, a manager that's just, you know, has an attitude, doesn't know how to interact with employees, has a holier than thou type of approach, abuses their authority, and just doesn't know how to communicate in a way that isn't demeaning or, you know, competent, that can be problematic. And so if you have those type of situations, I can understand why an employee will leave that type of, management. It's just common sense, and you really can't blame them. So, I think about just reflecting back on when I was a manager. If you guys are new to the channel, I know I've had quite a bit of new subscribers join the channel over the last 2-3 days. So some of you guys may not be familiar with my background, but I was a manager for 5 years prior to me getting laid off. So I know a little bit about being in management. And, one of the things that I learned from my market manager at the time, I had a sit down lunch with my district manager and one of our market managers when I got promoted into management back in 2015. And one of the questions I asked my market manager was, what type of advice, or what's one bit of advice that you can give me as a new manager? And he said, Anthony, always be fair, firm, and consistent across the board with your employees. And that stuck with me. And I think that's very important as a manager to have that type of leadership. Because one thing you don't want to do as a manager, you don't want to show favoritism to one employee and not the other. Those type of things employees definitely pay attention to, and it can really stand out. And it could become, very obvious if that's what you're doing. So you want to be fair across the board. And, you also have to learn how to communicate. Or I wouldn't say learn, you have to know how to communicate when you're in a leadership role to all of your employees. When you're dealing with different personalities, you have to learn how to communicate effectively, be able to get whatever message you're trying to get across without talking down on somebody or, making someone feel incompetent. You just have to learn how to communicate properly as a manager. It's very important. And then just setting an example for your employees. That's very important as a manager. Your employees will look at you, and if you set the wrong example, your employees will more than likely follow suit. So you have to set the tone, you have to set the standard, and you have to be consistent. You can't ask your employees to do things that you aren't doing as a manager. It's very important because I'm telling you, your team talk to each other, right? So if they see you doing something, cutting corners, but expecting them to not cut corners on certain things, that's not the way to go as a manager, right? It's very important that you set a good example for your team. Acknowledge them when they're doing something right? If they go out of their way to do something or help somebody out in some way, shape, form, or fashion, I think it's important to acknowledge that and show your appreciation. I think that keeps the morale high within your team, doing those sorts of things. And just, being very intentional about showing them that you appreciate them. I think that's how you not only retain employees, but also make people feel like they want to work, under you or with you, right? And so be supportive, be encouraging. Um, you know, if there are advancement opportunities in terms of moving up the corporate ladder, if sometimes you have employees that want to move up, and if you have somebody within your team that expresses that type of interest, I think it's important to advocate for them and just try to inspire them and motivate them if that's what they want to do, right? That was one of the things one of my old managers did to me, as far as just you know um, advocating for me. Before I got into management, I was expressing to him how bad I wanted to get into that role, and you know we would have conversations. And when his manager came in town to visit, he would let them know, like, Anthony wants to move into management at some point. And so I would shadow him, and I learned a lot before I even got into the role. So he kind of groomed me, and it all paid off. So, that's one thing I noticed with me being in the trucking industry. I rarely hear people interested in moving up the corporate ladder and getting out of the truck and moving into, an office type of atmosphere, I guess, right? I can count on one hand how many times I've had someone express interest in moving to a leadership role. Twice out of the 4 years that I've been on YouTube, I've had two people comment